Today, we're diving into an intriguing topic recently discussed by Morningstar, the idea of adding more buckets to the conventional three-bucket strategy for retirement planning. In the video, Benz talks about the role of additional buckets beyond the classic three, and how these might be used. We'll start by briefly looking at some criticisms of the classic three-bucket strategy. Then we'll jump into what Morningstar is proposing with their augmented bucket strategy, and analyze what I see as some problems with this new model. And we'll wrap up with what I think is a better solution. I want to make it clear that I have immense respect and appreciation for the work of Benz and Morningstar. However, in this instance, I find myself disagreeing with them. If you find topics like this helpful, take a moment to subscribe for future content. Your support is very much appreciated. Now, if you've been following my channel, you might have seen my earlier videos where I covered the simplified two-bucket strategy, and analyzed some criticisms of the three-bucket strategy by leading financial experts. Don't worry if you haven't seen those yet. I'll pop some links in the description for you to check out later. Now, I'll be upfront with you. I'm not a big fan of having more than two buckets, as I've discussed in detail before. But I'm approaching this with an open mind. So, let's dive in and see if you really need more than three buckets.
Please, sir. I want some more.
Let's kick things off with a quick recap of why I think the three-bucket strategy isn't ideal, or might even be flawed. First up, there's a lack of clear and authoritative guidance. There are so many variations on how to maintain your buckets, and no real consensus on what's best. It's easy for retirees to get lost and confused. Are these just slight variations on a core strategy, or are some of these fundamentally different approaches? Even Benz from Morningstar has described 4 different strategies in one article, and then added more decision rules in a later update. And that's just from one source. The second issue is complexity. Using the three-bucket strategy requires a lot of upfront planning and ongoing maintenance. More importantly, you need to digest and understand all these different, and sometimes conflicting bucket maintenance strategies and decision rules. As Kitces pointed out, standard rebalancing actually makes most bucket strategies unnecessary in the first place, at least from an asset allocation perspective. As the late Charlie Munger wisely said, simplicity has a way of improving performance, by enabling us to better understand what we are doing. It's about finding the right balance between simplicity and effectiveness. The third problem is that the three-bucket strategy can be too conservative, too early. By putting too much into conservative assets in the cash and income buckets, you introduce a cash drag effect on your portfolio, and potentially miss out on high returns from growth investments. This conservative allocation can directly impact how long your portfolio lasts, which is crucial as people are living longer and facing longer retirements. And finally, there's the issue of poor return on effort. When you put it all together, the complexity of the three-bucket strategy doesn't necessarily translate to better results. A number of financial experts including Kitces, Javier Estrada, Carsten Jeske and Rob Berger concluded that the three-bucket strategy offers a poor return on effort compared to simpler strategies. Now that we've covered those criticisms, let's look at what Benz from Morningstar is proposing in her recent video about adding more buckets. I'll include a link to that video in the description if you want to check it out yourself. Benz suggests adding a fourth bucket for long-term care. This is because many retirees don't have long-term care insurance. She describes this bucket as containing savings that you wouldn't want to use for your spending until you absolutely needed it. And if you end up not needing long-term care, well, you could pass these assets to your heirs. Then there's a fifth bucket for discretionary spending. Benz sees this as a good way to handle those big, lumpy expenses that come up in retirement. It fits well with the time segmentation idea of the bucket strategy, since retirees often do a lot of traveling in the first decade of retirement, and then slow down later. Benz finally discusses the idea of deploying these 5 buckets across different account types, which she calls silos. So you might have 5 buckets spread across each of your taxable, tax-deferred, and tax-free accounts. This could mean having up to 15 different buckets, potentially more, if you use all 5 in each account type. I'm not sure about you, but that's a lot of buckets. Even Benz seems to think so when she explained the model. If you've done some work around how you plan to take withdrawals in retirement, you probably have an idea of which of those silos you'll be spending from first. And that in turn, I think could argue for having multiple buckets within each of those silos, unfortunately. So, it gets a little bit more complicated. I'm not sure if that's Christine's way of suggesting that the average investor may need a financial advisor to effectively implement and maintain this strategy. Now, I have some concerns about adding these extra buckets to the classic 3-bucket strategy, which I already think is more complicated than it needs to be. Let me break down my 5 main concerns for you. First, it's not clear how these new buckets relate to the core 3 buckets. The original 3-bucket framework is based on time segmentation. It's about when you'll use the money. But these new buckets seem to mix time segmentation with expense categories, that is, what you'll spend the money on. The long-term care bucket seems to align with the long-term bucket, as you're not looking to draw from these till later in retirement. However, the discretionary bucket applies to short-term, mid-term, and long-term spending. This mix of time segmentation and expense categories is confusing, especially when it is not clear how these new buckets fit into the existing framework or relate to each other. My second concern is the lack of portfolio guidance. With the classic 3-bucket strategy, there's a pretty standard model: cash, fixed income, and stocks. But Benz doesn't give us much guidance on what to hold in these new buckets. Should the long-term care bucket be mostly stocks, or should it include some fixed income too? We're not told. And what about the discretionary bucket? Since this bucket applies to all time segments, should I hold cash, fixed income and stocks, all in this bucket? There's no guidance on asset allocation. This leads to my third concern: portfolio complexity. Without clear portfolio guidance, we're essentially forced to play a guessing game, making a lot of assumptions, and relying on our own judgment for some pretty important decisions. For example, if you already have the Vanguard Global All-Cap Index Fund in your long-term bucket, you'll need to find a similar but different proxy fund for the new long-term care bucket. This duplication complicates your portfolio unnecessarily. This gets even more complicated when you start thinking about the discretionary bucket, which might need to mirror aspects of all 3 original buckets, since discretionary spending spans all time segments. This means finding proxy funds for all the investments in the 3 core buckets. Clearly not a trivial task. My fourth concern is about rebalancing complexity. There are already a number of different bucket maintenance strategies and decision rules for the 3-bucket strategy. How do these work when we add 2 more buckets, or do we need new strategies and rules? For example, do we refill buckets 1 to 3 from the new long-term care bucket later in retirement, or do we leave the assets in bucket 4? And do we use the new discretionary bucket to fund discretionary expenses in the other buckets? Morningstar doesn't say, so once again, investors are left to figure it out on their own. Finally, I'm concerned that this is the wrong use of buckets. It almost seems like Morningstar is trying to use the bucket strategy to solve all sorts of retirement challenges, from sequence of returns risk to long-term care and discretionary expenses. While buckets can help with some of these issues, I'm skeptical about using them to solve what are essentially cash flow modeling problems. If you're trying to figure out if you'll have enough money for long-term care or discretionary spending, you'd be better off using a retirement cash flow modeling tool. I'm not convinced adding more buckets is the solution to these important questions. So, what's the big picture here? 2 things stand out to me. First, the psychological allure of the bucket strategy makes it tempting to augment it to address different retirement challenges. But as we've discussed, I think this is a mistake. Adding more buckets only amplifies its existing drawbacks: lack of clear guidance, unnecessary complexity, and poor return on effort. Second, this whole discussion reaffirms the value of simplicity. There's a reason I'm a strong advocate for the simplified 2-bucket strategy, which I discuss in another video. It addresses the key issues like sequence of returns risk, while providing the psychological comfort of the bucket approach, but without the confusion and complexity. Its simplicity and effectiveness come from adopting a total return approach and simple rebalancing, which both Michael Kitces and Javier Estrada favor. Why is simplicity so crucial? Well, as Charlie Munger put it, simplicity has a way of improving performance by enabling us to better understand what we are doing. If you are still here, thank you for your time, and I hope you found this helpful. Let me know in the comments if you have any questions or thoughts. And if you found this video helpful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.